My own family made me stand outside my sister's wedding because they said I would embarrass them. I stood there, holding a gift my late grandmother asked me to deliver. But nobody knew she had left behind one letter. A letter so powerful, it would stop the wedding before the bride ever said I do. This is the day my family learned who I really was. The morning air smelled of fresh roses and polished marble. Sunlight poured across the front entrance of the Grand Ashford Estate, one of the most exclusive wedding venues in Chicago. Luxury cars rolled through the iron gates every few minutes. A white Bentley. A black Rolls-Royce. A red Ferrari. Guests stepped out wearing designer suits and elegant gowns, smiling as cameras flashed. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of the Carter family. Emily Carter stood across the street holding a carefully wrapped wedding gift. Inside the small silver box was her late grandmother's pearl necklace. The necklace Grandma Eleanor had whispered about before she died. "Give this to your sister on her wedding day." Emily smiled sadly. "No matter what happens, I'll keep my promise." She took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. The security guard smiled politely. "Invitation, ma'am?" Emily reached into her purse. Before she could answer, a familiar voice stopped her. "She won't need one." Emily turned around. Richard Carter. Her father. Perfect black tuxedo. Silver cufflinks. Expensive watch. His smile disappeared the moment he looked at her. He glanced at the simple navy blue dress she had chosen. Then quietly sighed. "Emily, what are you doing here?" Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's Sophia's wedding. I'm her sister." Richard looked around to make sure no important guests were listening. Then lowered his voice. "Listen carefully. Today is very important for this family." Emily smiled gently. "I know. I came to celebrate." Richard shook his head. "No. You came to create problems." The words hit harder than she expected. Before Emily could respond, Sophia stepped out of the bridal suite. She looked beautiful in her custom-made white wedding gown. The bridesmaids surrounded her. Everyone admired her. Sophia noticed Emily. Her smile faded. She walked over, looked Emily up and down, then forced a polite smile. "You actually came." Emily nodded. "Of course." Sophia looked at Richard, then back at Emily. "Dad told you, right?" Emily blinked. "Told me what?" Richard took one slow breath, then spoke the sentence that would change everything. "You're not sitting inside." Emily stared at him. "What?" "You're staying outside." Silence. Even the security guard looked uncomfortable. Emily laughed nervously. "Very funny." "I'm serious." Emily felt her heartbeat rising. "You can't be serious." Richard folded his arms. "Most of our guests are investors, judges, politicians, people with influence." He looked directly into her eyes. "You don't fit the image we want today." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So, you don't want your own daughter at the wedding?" Richard answered immediately. "Not where people can see you." Sophia avoided eye contact. She didn't defend her sister. She simply whispered, "Please don't make today difficult." Emily looked at her. "I've spent my whole life making things easy for you." Sophia said nothing. Guests continued arriving. Some smiled at Emily, thinking she was waiting for someone. None of them knew she was the bride's older sister. Richard handed the security guard another guest list, then quietly said, "Don't let her inside unless I say so." The guard looked uncomfortable. "Sir." Richard interrupted. That's not a request. Emily stood alone on the sidewalk. Wedding music drifted from inside the ballroom. She could hear laughter. Applause. Glasses clinking. Everything she had imagined sharing with her family was happening just a few steps away. Without her. She looked down at the small silver gift box in her hands. Then whispered, "Grandma. I kept my promise. I just didn't know it would hurt this much." A single tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away before anyone could see. Because crying would only prove them right. At that exact moment, a black Mercedes slowly stopped at the front entrance. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped onto the red carpet. The groom, Ethan Brooks. He smiled politely at the guests. Then his eyes drifted across the entrance. They stopped on the woman standing alone outside the gate, holding a wedding gift, looking like she belonged, yet somehow wasn't allowed in. He frowned, turned to the wedding coordinator, and quietly asked one question. "Who is she?" The coordinator hesitated. Before she could answer, Richard Carter quickly stepped between them. With a practiced smile, he said, "Oh, don't worry about her. She's not important. Emily is just the unwanted daughter." Ethan looks at Emily one more time. Something about Richard's answer doesn't feel right. For the first time that day, the groom begins to suspect someone is lying. Ethan Brooks didn't walk inside. He kept watching the woman standing alone outside the gates. Something about the scene felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just wrong. He turned back to Richard Carter. "You said she's not important?" Richard smiled confidently. "Just someone we know." Ethan nodded slowly. But he didn't look convinced. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. A string quartet played softly. Champagne flowed. Everyone admired the luxury. Outside, Emily stood alone, holding a wedding gift no one wanted her to deliver. The wedding coordinator hurried toward Ethan. "Sir, the ceremony starts in 10 minutes. Ethan didn't move. Instead, he asked, "Why is she standing outside?" The coordinator hesitated. Before she could answer, Richard interrupted again. "Family misunderstanding. It'll be handled." Ethan simply replied, "I hope so." Emily sat quietly on a stone bench near the entrance. She wasn't angry. She wasn't crying anymore. She just stared at the silver gift box in her lap. Inside, Grandma Eleanor's pearl necklace. The one thing Grandma had protected for years. Emily whispered softly, "I wish you were here today." A little flower girl wandered away from the bridal party. She walked over to Emily. "You look sad." Emily smiled. "I'm okay." The little girl pointed toward the ballroom. "Why aren't you inside?" Emily searched for an answer. Finally she smiled gently. "I guess they forgot to save me a seat." The child frowned. "My mommy says family always sits together." Emily forced another smile. "Your mommy is right." The little girl hugged Emily for a second, then ran back inside. Several nearby guests watched the moment. One elderly guest whispered, "Who is she?" Another replied, "I don't know. But she doesn't look like staff." Meanwhile, inside the bridal suite, Sophia adjusted her veil. One bridesmaid finally asked, "Why is your sister outside?" Sophia froze, then answered quietly, "Because Dad said it's better this way." The room fell silent. No one argued. But no one looked comfortable either. Richard checked his watch. Everything was running perfectly. Guests were seated. Photographers were ready, the investors had arrived. Exactly the image he wanted. Then his assistant approached nervously. "Sir. There is one small issue." Richard sighed. "What now?" "The groom still hasn't entered the ballroom." Richard's smile disappeared. "What?" Across the courtyard. Ethan was still standing outside, watching Emily. He noticed something strange. Every guest walking past her smiled politely. Emily smiled back. Not one person ignored her. She wasn't behaving like someone who had caused trouble. She looked heartbroken. At that moment, a black taxi slowly stopped at the entrance. An elderly man stepped out. Gray suit, leather briefcase, walking cane. His eyes immediately searched the crowd. He looked directly at Emily, then quietly smiled. "Miss Carter. I've been looking for you." Emily stood up in surprise. "Mr. Harrison?" The old man nodded. "I promised your grandmother I would only come if this day ever happened." Emily's heart skipped a beat. He slowly lifted an old sealed envelope from his briefcase. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 7 words. "Open only if Emily is humiliated again." Emily stared at the envelope. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Grandma Eleanor. Before Emily could even speak, Ethan Brooks had already started walking toward them. The groom reaches the elderly lawyer and quietly asks, "Excuse me. What is that letter?" The old lawyer looks Ethan directly in the eyes and answers, "A letter powerful enough to stop this wedding." The groom notices Emily standing outside. The courtyard fell silent. The elderly lawyer held the sealed envelope carefully in both hands. Ethan looked at him. "What do you mean? Powerful enough to stop the wedding?" The old lawyer adjusted his glasses. "My name is William Harrison. I was Eleanor Carter's attorney for 34 years. He looked toward Emily. "And before she passed away, she gave me one final instruction." He gently lifted the envelope. "If Emily Carter is ever humiliated by her own family again, this letter must be opened immediately." A chill swept through everyone standing nearby. Richard hurried over. His face had turned pale. "What is this?" William calmly answered. "Mrs. Eleanor's final legal instruction." Richard reached for the envelope. "Give it to me." The lawyer stepped back. "I'm afraid I can't. It isn't addressed to you." Richard frowned. "It's my mother's letter." William looked directly into his eyes. "No. It belongs to the person she trusted most." Richard's expression changed. "Emily?" The lawyer nodded. Sophia walked over, still wearing her wedding dress. Guests had begun leaving their seats to see what was happening. Whispers spread through the crowd. "What's going on? Who's that lawyer? Why has the ceremony stopped?" Richard lowered his voice. "This isn't the time." William replied calmly. "Actually, this is exactly the time she planned for." The sentence landed like thunder. Ethan looked at Emily. "You knew about this?" Emily slowly shook her head. "I knew Grandma wrote letters. I didn't know she left one for today." She looked at the handwriting. A tear rolled down her cheek. "I haven't seen her writing in years." William carefully turned the envelope over. On the back, another sentence appeared, written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "If this letter is being opened, my family has broken my heart again." The crowd became completely silent. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Even the wedding photographer lowered his camera. Nobody wanted to interrupt this moment. Richard tried once more. William. Please. We'll discuss this privately. William answered immediately. No. Eleanor specifically wrote. No closed rooms. No private conversations, the truth deserves witnesses. Richard looked like someone had punched him. Ethan slowly reached for the envelope. Then stopped. He looked at Emily. I think. This belongs to you. Emily stared at the envelope. Her hands trembled. I can't. William smiled kindly. Then someone else must. Emily looked around. Every eye was on her. Finally. She looked at Ethan. If you read it. Please read every word. Ethan nodded. I promise. He carefully broke the old wax seal. The paper inside had turned slightly yellow with age. The handwriting was beautiful. Steady. Elegant. He unfolded the first page. Took a slow breath. Then began reading aloud. To whoever is holding this letter. If Emily is standing alone while the rest of my family celebrates. Then I was right about everything. The guests froze. Richard closed his eyes. Emily couldn't breathe. Ethan continued. Before you judge my granddaughter. You deserve to know who she really is. He turned to the second page. His expression suddenly changed. The confidence disappeared from his face. His eyes widened. He looked up at Emily. Then back at the letter. Then quietly whispered. My God. The guests leaned forward. Richard's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Sophia's hands began shaking. Whatever Ethan had just read had completely changed him. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Richard Carter. His voice was no longer calm. It carried disbelief and disappointment. Mr. Carter. Is this really true? Richard didn't answer. Because, for the first time in his life, he was terrified of the truth. The next line in Grandma Eleanor's letter reveals the one sacrifice Emily made years ago. A sacrifice so unbelievable that the groom begins questioning whether the wedding should happen at all. Nobody moved. Even the violinists had stopped playing. The only sound was Ethan slowly turning the second page of Grandma Eleanor's letter. He looked at Emily. Then at Richard. Then continued reading. 22 years ago. Richard Carter stood on the edge of bankruptcy. Several businessmen in the audience exchanged surprised looks. Richard had always claimed he built his empire alone. Ethan kept reading. The bank gave him 48 hours. If the payment wasn't made, he would lose everything. Richard lowered his head. His hands began to shake. Ethan continued. Richard believes I saved his company. He is wrong. The guests looked at one another. A murmur spread across the courtyard. If not Grandma, then who? Ethan unfolded the next page. His voice became quieter. Emily was only 21. She secretly sold the engagement ring her fiancé had given her and used every dollar to save her father's business. A collective gasp echoed across the wedding venue. Sophia's mouth slowly fell open. Richard looked frozen. Emily closed her eyes. She had prayed. No one would ever know. One guest whispered. She sold her engagement ring? Another answered. To save her father? An elderly businessman looked directly at Richard. You never told anyone this. Richard couldn't speak. Because he hadn't known. Ethan continued reading. Emily begged me never to tell Richard. She said. He paused. Then read the sentence that shattered the silence. If Dad finds out, he'll feel guilty. I'd rather lose the man I love than let my father lose everything. Several women in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. One elderly guest whispered, "What kind of daughter does that?" Another quietly replied, "The kind every parent dreams of." Sophia slowly turned toward Emily. Her voice barely came out. You broke off your engagement?" Emily smiled sadly. It wasn't his fault. He deserved someone who wasn't carrying an entire family. Sophia felt tears filling her eyes. You never told me. Emily answered softly. You never asked. Ethan turned another page. His expression grew even more serious. That wasn't the only sacrifice. Richard's heart nearly stopped. What? Ethan kept reading. 3 years later, Sophia received a full university scholarship. He looked directly at Sophia. She believes she earned it alone. Sophia smiled weakly. I did. Ethan slowly shook his head. No. You didn't. He lifted the letter. Grandma wrote that Emily secretly paid the remaining tuition, books, and housing. Working nights for 4 years. Sophia stumbled backward. No. That's impossible. Emily quietly answered. It wasn't impossible. It was just expensive. Sophia burst into tears. You paid for my education? Emily nodded. You wanted to become a doctor. I didn't want money to stop you. Sophia covered her face. For years, she had believed her parents sacrificed everything for her. Now she discovered. It had been her sister. The same sister she had just left standing outside. Ethan folded the letter halfway. Then looked at Richard Carter. His voice was cold. Your daughter gave up her future. To protect yours. He took one slow step closer. And today. You couldn't even give her a chair. Richard's legs almost gave out. The words hit harder than any accusation. Because they were true. At that exact moment, William Harrison quietly said, there is still one final page. Ethan looked down. The last page was still folded. Across the top, Grandma Eleanor had written only one sentence. If you've read this far, the hardest truth is still waiting. Ethan slowly unfolded the final page. His eyes widened instantly. He looked at Emily. Then at the bride. Then at Richard. The color drained from his face. He whispered. This changes everything. The final page doesn't reveal another sacrifice. It reveals a family secret that Grandma Eleanor kept hidden for decades. One that makes Ethan question whether this marriage should happen at all. The final page trembled in Ethan's hands. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. The entire wedding venue waited. Richard Carter stepped forward. His voice cracked. Ethan. What does it say? Ethan didn't answer. He kept staring at the page as if he wished the words weren't real. Finally, he looked directly at Emily. Did you know about this? Emily frowned. Know about what? I've never seen that letter before. Ethan slowly nodded. I believe you. Then, he turned toward the guests and began reading. If you are reading this final page, then Emily has once again been punished for loving this family. He paused. His voice became heavier. Richard. There is one truth I could never bring myself to tell you while I was alive. Richard stopped breathing. Ethan continued. The day Emily sold her engagement ring, she wasn't only saving your business. She was also protecting Sophia. The guests looked confused. Sophia whispered, "What does that mean?" Ethan unfolded the last part of the letter. The bank demanded collateral. Richard unknowingly signed documents that would have allowed the bank to seize the family home. The same home where Sophia was still living. A shocked silence spread across the courtyard. Richard stared at the ground. He remembered those papers. He had signed them without reading every page. Ethan continued. Emily discovered the mistake before anyone else. She never told Richard. She quietly paid the debt herself. Because she refused to let her little sister lose her home. Sophia burst into tears. No. Emily closed her eyes. She had buried that memory years ago. Richard's knees gave way. He collapsed into the nearest chair. His voice barely came out. You saved our home? Emily nodded once. I didn't think you needed to know. Richard covered his face. For 30 years. He had believed he built everything. Today. He learned the truth. The foundation of his success had been his oldest daughter. The guests were no longer whispering. They were staring at Richard. One businessman quietly said, You spent years praising yourself, while the real hero stood outside your own wedding. Another guest shook his head. I've never seen anything like this. Sophia slowly walked toward Emily. Still wearing her wedding dress. Her mascara had run down her face. She stopped only a few feet away. Then whispered, Why didn't you ever tell me? Emily smiled gently. Because I wanted you to enjoy your life. Not spend it feeling guilty. Sophia completely broke down. She fell to her knees. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Emily immediately bent down. She helped her sister stand. Then quietly hugged her. The crowd watched in complete silence. Ethan folded Grandma Eleanor's letter very carefully. He looked toward Richard. Then toward Sophia. Finally. He looked around at every guest. His voice was calm. But impossible to ignore. I've spent my entire life believing that a wedding joins two families. He looked directly at Richard. But today, I've learned something else. He took one slow breath. Then spoke the sentence that froze everyone. If this family can treat its strongest daughter this way, I need to ask myself whether I should become part of it. The music stopped. The photographers lowered their cameras. Even the wedding planner stood perfectly still. Richard looked up in panic. Ethan. Please. Don't do this. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he slowly reached toward his left hand. His fingers rested on his wedding ring, with hundreds of guests watching. Ethan begins sliding the wedding ring off his finger. No one knows whether he is about to cancel the wedding or make a decision that will change every life in the Carter family forever. Ethan's fingers rested on the wedding ring. The entire ballroom was silent. No music. No laughter. No whispers. Just hundreds of guests watching one man decide. He future. Richard took one desperate step forward. Ethan. Please don't make one mistake define our family. Ethan looked at him. Then quietly replied. This wasn't one mistake. This was 30 years of choices. Richard had no answer. Sophia slowly reached for Ethan's hand. Tears streamed down her face. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Ethan gently held her hand. I believe you. Sophia's eyes filled with hope. Then Ethan continued. But believing you doesn't erase what happened. He slowly removed the wedding ring. The soft sound of metal touching his palm echoed through the silent ballroom. Several guests gasped. The wedding planner covered her mouth. One bridesmaid quietly began crying. Richard looked like he was about to collapse. No. No. Ethan. Please. Ethan turned toward every guest. His voice remained calm. Today wasn't supposed to be about flowers. Or photographs. Or expensive decorations. He looked directly at Emily. A wedding begins with respect. And today, I watched this family deny respect to the one person who deserved it most. The guests slowly began standing. One after another. Not for the bride. Not for the groom. For Emily. An elderly couple started clapping. Then another family joined. Within seconds, the entire courtyard erupted into applause. Emily looked around in disbelief. She had spent her entire life feeling invisible. Today, strangers were giving her the respect her own family never had. Sophia suddenly stepped away from the altar. She walked directly to Emily. Still wearing her wedding gown. Still crying. She stopped in front of her older sister. Then, without saying a single word, she hugged her. Tightly. The applause became even louder. Sophia whispered through tears. I'm ashamed. Not because of today. Because I never noticed what you carried for all of us. Emily gently stroked her sister's hair. You're noticing now. That's enough. Richard slowly approached. Every step felt heavier than the last. He stopped a few feet away. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, his pride disappeared. He looked at Emily. Then quietly said, I don't deserve forgiveness. Emily remained silent. Richard continued. I spent years worrying about what strangers thought of me, while ignoring the daughter standing right beside me. His voice broke. I failed you. Emily looked into her father's eyes. There was no anger left. Only sadness. She answered softly. Dad. The hardest part wasn't being ignored. Richard looked up. Emily continued. The hardest part was believing that if I loved you enough, one day you'd love me the same way. Richard burst into tears. Many guests did too. Ethan stepped forward. He looked at Sophia. Then at Richard. Finally, he spoke the decision everyone had been waiting for. This wedding. He paused. The silence felt endless. Will not happen today. The guests gasped. Sophia quietly closed her eyes. She already knew. But Ethan wasn't finished. Not because I don't love Sophia. He turned toward her. I do. But I won't build a marriage on a day that began by humiliating an innocent person. He gently took Sophia's hands. If we ever marry, it will be after this family learns how to become a family again. Sophia nodded through tears. I'll wait. At that moment, William Harrison quietly walked toward Emily. He smiled warmly. There is one final instruction from your grandmother. Emily looked surprised. There was more? William nodded. He handed her a small brass key. Attached to it was a tiny handwritten tag. It read, For Emily. When she finally knows her worth. Emily stared at the key. What does it open? William smiled. Tomorrow morning. You'll find out. The mystery wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning, Emily unlocks what Grandma Eleanor left behind with the brass key. Inside is something no one expected, a final gift that changes Emily's future forever. The next morning, Chicago was unusually quiet. For the first time in years, Emily woke up without the weight of trying to earn someone's love. The wedding was over. The humiliation was over. But Grandma Eleanor's final gift was still waiting. At exactly 9 a.m., William Harrison arrived. The same leather briefcase. The same calm smile. He looked at the small brass key in Emily's hand. "Are you ready?" Emily nodded. "I think so." William smiled. "Your grandmother spent 10 years preparing this day." They drove to a quiet part of downtown Chicago. The car stopped in front of a beautiful old brick building. Above the entrance, a bronze plaque read, "The Eleanor Carter Family Foundation." Emily looked confused. "I've never been here." William smiled. "No one in your family has." He unlocked the front door. The lobby lights slowly came on. Everything was spotless. As if someone had been waiting. Emily looked around. Family photographs decorated the walls. Old letters. Awards. Charity projects. Everything carried Grandma Eleanor's name. Then Emily noticed something. A second plaque. Still covered with velvet. William gently removed the cloth. It read, "The Emily Carter Center for Family Hope." Emily covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. "My name." William nodded. "Your grandmother believed one day you would build the family you never received." William handed Emily one final envelope. Inside was Grandma Eleanor's last handwritten letter. Emily unfolded it carefully. The first line made her smile through tears. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, you survived." Emily laughed softly. Even Grandma's sense of humor hadn't disappeared. She continued reading. "I watched you give everything and ask for almost nothing. Never mistake kindness for weakness. The strongest people are often the quietest." Emily wiped away another tear. The final paragraph read, "I cannot choose the family you were born into. But I can help you build the family you deserve. Everything in this foundation now belongs to you. Use it to help people who have been forgotten. Just as you once were." Signed simply. Love always. Grandma Eleanor. Weeks passed. Emily accepted the responsibility. The foundation opened its doors. It provided emergency housing for struggling families, scholarships for students, counseling for abused children, financial help for single parents. Thousands of lives began changing. Not because Emily wanted revenge. Because she chose compassion over bitterness. One afternoon, Richard quietly arrived. He didn't come with flowers. He didn't come with excuses. He simply walked into the foundation and volunteered. Every week. Without cameras. Without publicity. He answered phones. Moved boxes. Served meals. 4 months. He never asked Emily for forgiveness again. He simply tried to become a better man. Sophia also changed. She postponed the wedding. She and Ethan spent the next year rebuilding trust, not only with each other, but with the family they hoped to create. 1 year later, they married. Not in a luxury ballroom, but in the foundation's garden. The first invitation was handed personally to Emily. This time, her name wasn't missing. It was printed at the very top. Guest of honor. Emily smiled. She accepted. Not because everything had been forgotten, but because healing had finally become stronger than hurt. As the ceremony ended, Richard quietly walked over. He looked at his oldest daughter. His eyes filled with tears. "Emily, for years, I thought success meant building a business." He looked around at the families the foundation had helped. Then back at her. "Today I finally understand. Success is raising a child who still chooses kindness after the world gave her every reason to hate. Emily smiled warmly. She hugged her father. Not because the past had disappeared, but because they had both chosen a better future. The greatest victory isn't watching the people who hurt you fall, it's rising so high that you no longer need their approval to be happy. The camera slowly pulled back. Children laughed in the foundation garden. Families smiled. Sophia and Ethan exchanged their vows. Richard stood proudly in the front row. And Emily, for the first time in her life, didn't feel like the girl left outside the wedding. She finally felt like she was home.